Hello folks, welcome back. Today I'm extremely excited to introduce to you our new project, which is an astronomical regulator. These are often the pinnacle of clockmaking. This would be a clockmaker's absolute top effort, and we got our hands on one. These clocks are interesting in a lot of ways. One of them is that the hands are not concentric. You can see the dial here has 3 dials. There's the main ring, which is minutes. This lower ring is hours, and the upper ring is seconds. And this dial is massive. I haven't measured it. I think this is probably either a 16 or an 18-inch dial, which is very, very cool. Taking a quick look at the movement, we can see that this actually has jewel bearings all the way through the movement. This is really fantastic. I'm excited to get into this. This has a number of mechanisms that are a little odd for those of us used to looking at a normal clock. And one of those is the jump hours. It'll be easier to show you with the dial on and the hands on, but if I turn the minute arbor, you can see this lifting system ratchets this lower gear, which causes the hour wheel to advance a partial hour. On the side of the movement are 2 drums. This one here has grooves in it. And as I turn it, you can see the cord wants to move to one side or the other. And the drum that actually receives the cable does not have grooves, which is really kind of an interesting design. This is a huge movement, again, as using my hand for scale. It has 6 movement pillars. The plates are huge. These have got to be 1/4 of an inch thick. Here's our verge. I want to show you the jewels in this. You can see them here, the palette stones. I think these are probably garnet. I don't think they're ruby, but those are very cool. Everything about this clock is massive. Again, using my hand as scale, this is just huge. Even the weight for, the pulley for the weight is huge. This comes apart with 1 screw. Everything is pinned in place. Just runs like clockwork. Here's our pendulum rod. This thing, again, is massive. And we have an iron rod in the middle and brass on the outside. Now, to be honest, I have not analyzed how this exactly works yet. This is a mercury clock, which is where the main compensation happens. So brass and steel are often used to compensate in a gridiron kind of way. And there may be some function of this here, but honestly, I have not figured that out yet. We've got, at the top end, here's our suspension spring. We've got our beat adjustment mechanism. And then this is a continuous piece of iron all the way down to the middle of the clock. And then this is pinned into this front brass plate here. And that has, there's some adjustment that can be done here with this screw. But I really don't understand this yet. So we'll take this apart and we'll see if this has any impact in operating the clock or if it's just designed to look cool. But lots of pieces of this clock are really exciting. I've never worked on a clock like this before. One of the first things that we're going to do is silver the dial. I've done a couple of videos on dial silvering, so I'm going to do kind of the speed version here. As we look at the dial to get ready to silver, this one I'm really excited in that the engraving is actually in pretty good shape. I don't think I'm going to have to re-letter anything. I just have to basically polish the brass and then perform the silvering steps. So this is going to be exciting, and we'll dig into this now. I've disassembled the dial, and I just want to talk through the general steps that we're going to take in silvering. So this is brass. Silvering is a chemical reaction where silver from a chemical solution attaches itself to the brass work and turns it a silver color. And there's a few steps to that. The first is repairing any of the engraving. I've done a couple videos where I have done the full re-engraving process. This clock, I think, is fine. I'm looking at this, and there's a little bit of patina, but the engraving is in really great shape. So we're going to skip that, and honestly, that's a pretty significant chunk of the work, so this helps us out a lot. The next step, I'm going to polish this brass. I'm going to use a piece of 800 grit sandpaper. Now, there's different opinions on what kind of finish you want on the brass. Some people like really coarse grain as a final finish. I'm not sure that I do, and I definitely don't for these nameplates. So I'm going to, I think, use 800 grit, and we'll see how that looks. But I'm going to go for not a high grain finish on this at all. So when the brass is all polished up, then it's activated, the oxide is gone. We use a 2-step process for the actual silvering. This is part of a kit coming from Time Savers, and there's 2 chemical components. The first is the silvering powder. This is silver chloride, And this is what actually causes the silver to change places with the copper ions in the brass. And then step 2, this is actually cream of tartar. So you got tartar sauce out of your fridge. This is essentially what's in that. And the silvering process puts the silver on the brass. This step 2 brightens the brass and makes it actually look silver, because after silvering step 1 here, this looks kind of brown and it doesn't look silver. So both of these are applied with a tiny bit of water, and I'll show you that process now, and we'll just speed through this. And what I'm going to do after this is silvered, the silvering does need some protection for it to last. I am going to spray it with some clear lacquer, and that should protect the finish for a long time. There's different ways to do that. I've done it several different ways, and on this clock I think I'm going to use this lacquer, and that should be a nice finish. One thing that can happen after time is if you didn't do a good enough job of cleaning up the silvering chemicals, you can get kind of a rust-colored bloom. So I think the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to polish this, silver it, and then let it sit a day or so to see if any of that develops, because it's a pain in the butt to get the lacquer off to do it again. Whereas if I see something up, I can just touch up the silvering much more easily. So those are the general steps. I'm going to get at it. Silvering will not work if the brass isn't bright. So this is a necessary step. The engraving is into the brass, so I'm sanding off the top layer. And you have to be careful if you're considering silvering a dial to make sure that it's actually an engraved dial, as this one is, where you can see the recessed engraving. If you have a dial that is silvered and then after the silvering the letters were inked on, this is not going to work for you, because this sanding is going to remove all of your lettering on your dial, and you'd have to replace that in some way. There are techniques to do that. There's water slide decaling, but this clock, I don't have to worry about that. I can just get this polished up, and the engraving should be just fine. You know you're done sanding when the brass is all the same color, and it's a little hard to show in this camera shot, but I'm not where I need to be yet. I've got different colors of brass here, and if I try to silver this, the silver isn't going to evenly take. I did want to make one quick comment. This is a completely handmade clock, and this brass was hammered into sheets, and there are occlusions and things all over the clock. If you wanted to try to get rid of those, you'd have to remove way too much material. So this is a great case of embrace the patina. We're not going to worry about that. All I'm doing here is sanding this enough to activate the brass, to get rid of the oxide so that the silvering will take. I'm very happy to have whatever marks survive this process. This clock is close to 200 years old. It's going to be great. Time for step 1. I'm going to take a little bit of my silver chloride, put this on my tray, and I'm going to put just a couple drops of water nearby. And what I'm trying to do here is, using a cotton ball, pick up my silvering powder here, and I'm just going to work it into the brass. And this is going to change color, and when it changes color, you know you're done. It takes a couple minutes for this to take effect, and as I mentioned, this is not going to be silver when we're done here. This is going to be kind of a brownish color, and I'm going to keep working this in until it takes. You can see it's starting to turn above the lettering here, so we're underway. And this just is an abrasive process a little bit. That's kind of like salt. Actually, chloride is a salt. It feels a little bit like table salt here. And we just work it in. We need a little bit more here. Until we have kind of a dull grayish brown color. And if I see any spots that aren't taking this, I can hit it with sandpaper again until I am happy that it's all changing to the right tone here. We're making some progress. I just got to get the corners here. It's kind of a subtle change. If you don't have reasonable lighting in this, you might have a hard time even seeing the change. But if you're observant, it does look a little different. All right, I think we're done with step number 1. Now I'm going to do step number 2, the cream of tartar. And this is where the magic actually starts being visible. Put a little of that on here. Have another damp cotton ball. We're going to rub that in, and this is when it's actually going to start turning silver. There, you can kind of see it. The camera automatically adjusts the color to try to do what it thinks is right. And so I'll do a shot after this is done to show the comparison between this one and the one that we haven't silvered yet. A little bit more of our step 2. Just a drop of water. You don't want this to be too wet. I'm wearing gloves for this, not because it's necessary, but because somebody complained about it in a prior silvering video. If you want to wear gloves, go for it. There's so much water involved in this that any finger oil really isn't likely to hang around, but if that makes you more comfortable, go for it. And so I thought we would just do it this way today. I think we're in good shape. I'm going to do the edge of this as well. I'm going to go back to my step 1 and just make sure I'm getting the edges of these roundels. And it's not a problem to go back and forth between step 1 and step 2 here. And again, if you see something that isn't coming out to your liking, go ahead and sand a little bit and then return back on here. You're not really locked in until you lacquer it. Okay, you're never going to believe this. This has another side. We have this font, August, and we have this font. Funny, never saw this before. We better silver this side up too. And here is our silvered result. Now, I don't believe gloves are important during the silvering, but now that the silvering is done and I have not yet lacquered it, gloves are important because my finger oil now could react with this. So I'm using gloves now and I've got it on a paper towel, but I wanted to show you the difference between silvered and unsilvered. And just for fun, look at that. Under Richard, we have another font as well. So we can choose between Big August Richard and smaller August Richard. Very fun. The round parts of the dial are going to be the same process mostly, except I'm going to use my sanding jig so that I can get my sanding rings concentric with the dial. I've showed this before, and normally I have a metal stick that I've made that will reach this, but this dial is so big, I'm going to use just a modified paint stick to get this going with my sandpaper. I'm going to start with 600 on this because there might be some varnish or shellac. I tried to get some of it off with acetone, but we'll go this way. I'm going to put a couple drops of water on the dial just to facilitate sanding a little bit. And other than that, this process is going to be the same. There you can see our angular sanding marks starting. I'm going to do this until this is bright. I've done a whole bunch of sanding. We'll see if it's enough. On to step 1 here. One of the reasons I don't like super coarse grain is it's hard sometimes to get the silvering powder into the grain, so you've got some yellow that can stick through sometimes. This dial ended up having better luck with 400 grit, but as you use it, it wears down, so I don't know what the equivalent would be, but this is plenty of grain for me. Here's the result of our silvering. I think the subdials and the nameplates came out really great, really happy with those. The main dial, to be honest, this is not the result that I quite hoped for. It'll be fine, but I was having trouble with some kind of contamination right there. It looks almost pink. And I did this, I think, 3 times before I was sort of content with the graining on this big dial. This is actually laminated, so there's a relatively thin layer of brass on top, and it looks like there's steel in the middle and then brass on the bottom again. So I think this is just a reflection of the fact that brass was expensive, and this is essentially like a gold-filled watch case design, and this is so thin here. Any more work I do on this is going to risk making this problem a lot worse. So I think it'll be okay. We'll put it together and we'll take a look at what it looks like when all the elements are in place. Again, it's just so fun that there's a little Easter egg on these. I I silvered one of these intentionally, this one just out of habit, and then the other just kind of happened while I was touching the back of it. The hour ring also has that, so you can see this is what the silvering looks like if you don't do any brass prep. So wherever there was sort of clean brass, the silvering took, and wherever it didn't, it looks kind of gross. So the second style does not have anything behind it. So it's just odd that, again, I think brass was such a precious resource that August Richard was unhappy with his first crack at engraving, and so he just flipped the parts over and carried on. I've got the subdials and the nameplates back on, and it's going to be fine. You know, I was hoping for a little bit better result of the silvering process, but there's so many occlusions in the brass, and it's so thin that I think if I do any more, I'm going to just make it worse. So we're going to stop. It's going to be fine in the clock. Anyway, I think this is a good place to break for this video. There's lots more to come on the movement, and I'm excited to get to that. But for now, stay tuned, and thanks for watching.